I spent 5 years building my reputation at Hudson and Keener Logistics, climbing from coordinator to operations manager through sheer determination and countless late nights cleaning up other people's messes. This morning, I watched my career crumble in a conference room full of executives as I was demoted to assistant for the same incompetent director who'd been stealing credit for my work. The smug satisfaction in Chad Walker's eyes made my stomach turn. He thought he'd broken me. What he didn't know was that I'd stumbled onto his dirty little secret, and now I had the ammunition to destroy him. I'm Jessica Morgan, and 15 minutes ago, I was the operations manager at Hudson and Keener Logistics. Now I'm staring at a termination letter disguised as a restructuring opportunity, while my colleagues avoid eye contact across the mahogany conference table. We're excited to announce that Jessica has volunteered to step back from her current role to support our new strategic initiatives, Chad Walker announced to the room, his voice dripping with false enthusiasm. The bastard made it sound like I'd begged for a demotion. She'll be transitioning to a project support role where her attention to detail will be invaluable. Attention to detail. Code 4, she's too much of a perfectionist to lead. I felt my jaw clench as murmurs of polite approval rippled through the room. These people, my colleagues, my peers, were actually nodding along with this charade. Chad's eyes found mine across the table, and I saw the triumph there. He'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. The late-night emails questioning my decisions, the subtle undermining in client meetings, the way he'd started excluding me from strategic discussions. I should have seen it coming. Jessica has been instrumental in maintaining our operational excellence, he continued. But we need fresh leadership to tackle the challenges ahead. Fresh leadership? He was 32 years old and had been handed his position because he married the chairman's daughter. The closest he'd come to operational excellence was learning to spell logistics correctly in his emails. I wanted to stand up and tell everyone exactly what kind of leader Chad Walker really was. About the Henderson account he'd nearly lost because he couldn't read a shipping manifest. About the military contracts where I'd spent weekends fixing his routing errors. About the suppliers who called me directly because they knew he was useless. Instead, I sat there and took it. Because I had something better than an outburst. 1 week ago, I'd been working late when Chad's office door hadn't fully closed during what he thought was a private Zoom call. I'd heard fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. Something about adjusted shipping manifests and percentage arrangements with a company I'd never heard of. When I'd quietly walked past his office, I'd seen documents on his screen that looked nothing like our standard military logistics reports. That's when I knew. Chad Walker wasn't just incompetent, he was corrupt. And he was using Hudson and Keener as his personal money laundering operation. Jessica, would you like to say anything? Chad's voice cut through my thoughts, and I realized the room was looking at me expectantly. I cleared my throat and managed what I hoped was a professional smile. I'm committed to supporting the company's goals in whatever capacity serves us best. The words tasted like ash, but I delivered them with the same steady tone I'd used in hundreds of client presentations. Chad's smile widened. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd finally put me in my place, reduced me to a grateful subordinate who'd accepted her fate gracefully. The other executives were already moving on to the next agenda item, dismissing me as yesterday's news. If only they knew what I'd spent the last week doing. While Chad was orchestrating my downfall, I'd been quietly photographing documents, forwarding myself emails, and building a case that would turn his little victory into the beginning of his destruction. I gathered my papers and left the conference room with my head held high. Let them think I was defeated. Let Chad believe he'd successfully eliminated his biggest threat. He had no idea that his biggest threat was just getting started. I grew up in Cedar Hill, Missouri, where my father worked double shifts at the Ford plant and my mother cleaned houses to keep us afloat. I learned early that nothing comes easy, and if you want something, you work for it. No handouts, no shortcuts, no daddy's connections to smooth the way. When I graduated from Missouri State with a logistics degree, I had exactly $347 in my bank account and a burning determination to prove that merit still mattered in corporate America. Hudson and Keener hired me as a shipping coordinator. and I spent the next 5 years clawing my way up through pure grit and competence. Chad Walker, on the other hand, had married into his position. Literally. His wife Emma was the daughter of Richard Hudson, our chairman of the board, and Chad's promotion to operations director had been announced just 6 months after their wedding. The man couldn't organize a 2-car funeral procession, but he had the golden ticket that money couldn't buy. Family connections. Hudson and Keener had been a solid mid-tier logistics company when I started, handling everything from military supply contracts to retail chain distribution. We weren't Amazon, but we were reliable, efficient, and profitable. That changed when Chad took over operations. Suddenly, we were missing deadlines, losing clients, and dealing with complaints I'd never heard before. Chad's solution was always the same: blame the coordinators, restructure the departments, and create new strategic initiatives that went nowhere. Meanwhile, he'd take credit for any success and distance himself from every failure. The worst part was watching the company culture rot from the inside. Chad ruled through fear and favoritism, promoting people who kissed his ring and marginalizing anyone who questioned his decisions. He'd built a network of loyal subordinates who'd throw their own mothers under the bus if it meant staying in Chad's good graces. I'd never played those games. When Chad screwed up the Patterson military contract by routing 12,000 pounds of equipment to the wrong base, I'd quietly fixed it over a weekend without making a scene. When he'd nearly lost our biggest retail client by promising impossible delivery times, I'd worked out a compromise that saved the relationship. Time and again. I'd been his safety net, cleaning up his messes while he took the credit. I thought my competence would protect me. I believed that results mattered more than politics, that hard work would eventually be recognized and rewarded. I was naive enough to think that Chad saw me as a valuable asset rather than a threat. The truth was, Chad had been threatened by me from day one. Every problem I solved made him look incompetent by comparison. Every client who praised my work was an implicit criticism of his leadership. Every time I had to step in and fix something, it reminded everyone, including his father-in-law, that he was in over his head. So he'd been planning my downfall for months, carefully building a case against me while I was busy doing his job. He'd started questioning my decisions in meetings, second-guessing my recommendations, and slowly excluding me from strategic discussions. The restructuring wasn't about company needs. It was about eliminating the one person who knew exactly how incompetent he was. What Chad didn't realize was that his war against me had given me a front-row seat to his other activities. While he was focused on undermining my position, I'd been watching him operate, noticing the discrepancies in his reports, the mysterious meetings with contractors I'd never heard of, and the way certain shipments seemed to disappear from our tracking systems. And last week, when I'd overheard that Zoom call, all the pieces had finally clicked into place. Chad Walker wasn't just a nepotistic incompetent, he was a criminal. And he'd been using Hudson and Kiner as his personal ATM machine. Now, sitting in my newly diminished role, I almost felt grateful. He'd just given me the time and motivation I needed to bring him down. The email arrived at 8:47 a.m., exactly 15 minutes before the meeting that would destroy my career. The subject line read, "Organizational restructuring, immediate action required." And the body was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak that basically said I was being demoted effective immediately. I read it twice, my coffee growing cold in my hands. 5 years of excellence, reduced to a paragraph of HR-approved nonsense about evolving company needs and strategic realignment. No phone call, no face-to-face conversation, no explanation. Just a digital knife in the back delivered with the emotional warmth of a parking ticket. Walking into that conference room felt like entering my own execution. The mahogany table was surrounded by familiar faces, people I'd worked with, collaborated with, even considered friends. But as I took my seat, I could feel the shift in the room's energy. They already knew. Chad had made sure of that. "We're making some exciting changes to our operational structure," Chad announced, his voice carrying that practiced enthusiasm of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. He stood at the head of the table like a conquering general. His expensive suit and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to the cheap blazer I'd bought at Kohl's 3 years ago. Jessica has volunteered to step back from her current role to focus on project support, where her meticulous attention to detail will be invaluable to our strategic initiatives. Volunteered. The word hit me like a slap. I felt my face flush with anger and humiliation as heads around the table nodded in approval. Marcus from accounting actually smiled and gave me a thumbs up, as if this was some kind of promotion. Sarah from HR was furiously scribbling notes, probably already planning my replacement. This transition will allow us to bring in fresh leadership for the challenges ahead. Chad continued, and I caught the slight emphasis on fresh, code for younger, more compliant, less threatening to my authority. The worst part was the silence. Not one person in that room questioned the decision. Not one colleague who'd benefited from my work spoke up. They just sat there, accepting Chad's narrative because it was easier than challenging the boss's son-in-law. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and tell them about the Henderson account that Chad had nearly lost through sheer incompetence, about the military contracts where I'd worked weekends fixing his routing disasters, about the suppliers who called me directly because they knew he was useless. Instead, I sat there with my hands folded, maintaining the professional composure that had served me well for 5 years. Because I had something better than an outburst waiting in the wings. That overheard phone call from last week kept echoing in my mind. Chad's voice, hushed and urgent. The manifest adjustments are in place. Yes, the percentage arrangement we discussed. The Peterson Group account will handle the discrepancies. Peterson Group. I'd never heard of them in 5 years of handling our military contracts, but I'd made note of the name, along with the fragments of conversation about adjusted shipping manifests and percentage arrangements that sounded nothing like legitimate business. Jessica, would you like to say anything? Chad's voice cut through my thoughts, and I realized the room was staring at me expectantly. I cleared my throat and managed what I hoped was a gracious smile. I'm committed to supporting the company's goals in whatever capacity serves us best. Chad's smile widened with satisfaction. He thought he'd broken me, reduced me to a grateful subordinate accepting her fate. The other executives were already moving on to budget discussions, dismissing me as yesterday's news. If only they knew what I'd been doing during those late nights they thought I'd been sulking about my demotion. While Chad was orchestrating my downfall, I'd been quietly building his. I gathered my papers and left the conference room with my head held high, ignoring the pitying looks from my former peers. Let them think I was defeated. Let Chad believe he'd successfully eliminated his biggest threat. He had no idea that his biggest threat was just getting started. The first thing I did after my demotion was absolutely nothing. I didn't storm out, didn't send angry emails, didn't complain to HR about the injustice of it all. I simply went to my new, significantly smaller office and began organizing my reduced responsibilities with the same methodical precision I'd always applied to my work. My colleagues were watching for a reaction. I could feel their eyes on me in the hallway, waiting to see if I'd crack, if I'd give Chad the satisfaction of a public meltdown. Instead, I smiled politely at everyone, answered emails promptly, and attended meetings with the same professional demeanor I'd maintained for 5 years. But while I appeared to be accepting my fate, I was actually beginning the most important project of my career. That overheard phone call had given me a thread, and I intended to pull it until Chad's entire operation unraveled. The Peterson Group, that name he'd mentioned, didn't exist in any of our official client databases. I'd checked twice, yet somehow they were involved in our military contracts, and Chad was discussing percentage arrangements with them. I started small, and I started careful. During lunch breaks, I'd print shipping manifests from our database, comparing the official records with the backup files stored on our shared server. At first glance, everything looked normal. But when I cross-referenced the weight specifications with the actual transport logs, discrepancies began to emerge. A shipment to Fort Bragg that was listed as 8,000 pounds of medical supplies had somehow weighed 6,200 pounds when it actually shipped. The difference wasn't logged as an error, it had simply vanished from the paperwork. Another shipment to Camp Pendleton showed similar gaps, with materials mysteriously lightening between the initial manifest and final delivery. I started staying late, using the empty office to access systems I normally wouldn't have time to explore. Chad's computer password was embarrassingly predictable. Emma 2019, the year he'd married into his position. His email archives were a goldmine of careless communication, including several exchanges with someone named David Martinez from something called Strategic Logistics Solutions. The more I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Chad was systematically skimming from military shipments, creating phantom weight reductions and billing the difference to shell companies. The Peterson Group wasn't a client, it was a cover. A way to launder the stolen fees through what appeared to be legitimate subcontracting arrangements. But I needed more than email trails and manifest discrepancies. I needed financial proof, evidence that would be undeniable even to Chad's father-in-law. That's when I discovered the beauty of my new position. As project support staff, I'd been given access to the company's historical archives, boxes of old contracts, shipping records, and financial documents that Chad assumed were too tedious for anyone to review. What he didn't realize was that those archives contained the original, unaltered versions of every document he'd been manipulating. I spent my lunch hours in the dusty storage room, photographing contracts with my phone and comparing them to the digital versions in our current system. The alterations were subtle but consistent. Weight adjustments, client name changes, and mysterious additional fees that appeared on invoices but never made it to our official accounting records. The breakthrough came when I found a contract from 6 months ago for a shipment to Naval Base San Diego. The original paper version showed a straight logistics fee of $47,000, but the digital version in our system showed the same shipment with an additional $12,000 specialized handling fee paid to Strategic Logistics Solutions. I'd found the smoking gun. Chad wasn't just skimming from individual shipments, he was systematically defrauding the U.S. military, creating fake fees and funneling them through shell companies. The scope of his operation was staggering, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past year alone. But I couldn't move yet. I needed to understand the full extent of his network, identify all the players, and build a case so airtight that even his family connections couldn't save him. I had to be patient, methodical, and absolutely certain. Chad thought he'd neutralized me by reducing my role. In reality, he'd just given me the time and access I needed to destroy him completely. Chad's paranoia kicked in faster than I'd expected. Maybe it was the way I'd asked a pointed question about shipping discrepancies during Tuesday's logistics meeting. Or perhaps he'd noticed me staying late more often. Either way, by Thursday morning, I could feel his eyes on me. "Jessica, a word?" He appeared at my office door with that fake smile he reserved for moments when he was about to screw someone over. "I've been thinking about your role in our strategic initiatives." I looked up from my computer, where I'd been reviewing what appeared to be legitimate purchase orders but were actually part of my growing evidence file. "Of course, Chad, what can I help you with?" "Well, I've realized that your skills might be better utilized in a more focused environment." He stepped into my office and closed the door, a gesture that immediately put me on alert. "We're launching a new project, digitizing our historical contracts and shipping records. It's detailed work, perfect for someone with your attention to accuracy." My blood ran cold. The historical contracts were where I'd found the smoking gun evidence of his fraud. He was trying to isolate me from the very documents that would destroy him. "That sounds interesting," I managed, keeping my voice steady. "Where would this project be located?" "The back room." He said it like he was offering me a promotion. "You'll have complete access to all our archived materials, and you can work independently without the distractions of daily operations." The back room. Everyone knew what that meant. It was where Hudson and Keener sent people to die professionally. A windowless storage area in the basement where unwanted employees were given make-work projects until they found new jobs or simply gave up. In 5 years, I'd seen a dozen people disappear into the back room, and none of them had ever emerged with their careers intact. When would this transition happen? I asked, already knowing the answer. Immediately. I know it's sudden, but the client demands are urgent, and frankly, I think you'll find it refreshing to work without the pressure of daily operational demands. Client demands? There were no clients demanding digitized historical contracts. Chad was simply removing me from the equation before I could cause him any more trouble. He'd probably spent the last few days wondering why I was being so compliant, so quiet, so unlike the fighter he'd expected me to be. I appreciate the opportunity, I said, and watched relief flood his face. He'd expected resistance, maybe even an argument. Instead, I was accepting his banishment gracefully, confirming his belief that I'd been thoroughly defeated. What Chad didn't understand was that he'd just handed me the keys to his kingdom. The back room might have been professional purgatory, but it was also where the company kept its most sensitive historical documents. While other employees saw it as exile, I saw it as unrestricted access to 20 years of contracts, shipping records, and financial documents that could expose the full scope of his operation. I'll start moving my things this afternoon, I told him, and his smile widened with satisfaction. Excellent. I think you'll find this new role very enlightening. As he left my office, I almost laughed at the irony. Chad thought he was protecting himself by isolating me from current operations. In reality, he was giving me unlimited access to the evidence that would destroy him, along with the solitude needed to build an airtight case without interruption. That afternoon, I packed my few personal items and moved to the back room. The space was exactly as depressing as I'd imagined. Fluorescent lighting, concrete walls, and rows of filing cabinets containing decades of corporate history. To Chad, it was a tomb for my career. To me, it was a treasure trove. Within hours, I'd found contracts that predated Chad's arrival, showing normal profit margins and straightforward billing. I'd discovered shipping records that revealed his fraud had been escalating over the past 18 months, growing bolder as he became more confident in his immunity. Most importantly, I'd found a filing cabinet marked Executive Contracts that contained agreements I'd never seen before, documents that would prove Chad's theft wasn't just about money. It was about betraying the trust of the military personnel who depended on our supplies. Chad had given me everything I needed to destroy him. Now I just had to be patient enough to use it. The back room became my war room. For 3 weeks, I methodically combed through 20 years of Hudson & Kiner's corporate history, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Chad's fraud wasn't just about skimming shipping fees. He'd created an entire shadow network of shell companies, fake subcontractors, and phantom services that existed solely to funnel money from military contracts into his personal accounts. The Peterson Group was just the tip of the iceberg. I'd uncovered at least 6 other entities, all traced back to bank accounts registered under his wife's maiden name. The most damning evidence came from a filing cabinet marked Confidential Executive Agreements. Inside, I found contracts with a defense subcontractor called Meridian Strategic Solutions that had been blacklisted by the Pentagon 2 years ago for money laundering. Yet Chad had been routing shipments through them for months, using forged documentation to bypass the military's vendor screening process. But I needed more than historical evidence. I needed current proof of ongoing fraud, something that would catch Chad in the act and make it impossible for him to claim these were old mistakes or accounting errors. That's when I discovered his fatal flaw: arrogance. Chad had gotten so comfortable with his immunity that he'd stopped being careful. His computer passwords were predictable. His email trails were careless. And he'd started conducting his illegal business during regular office hours. When I hacked into his calendar system from the backroom's computer, I found a pattern of recurring meetings with David Martinez from Strategic Logistics Solutions, meetings that never appeared on any official company schedule. The next meeting was scheduled for Monday morning at 10 a.m. I knew from my research that Martinez was the bagman, the person who collected the stolen fees and distributed them through the shell company network. If I could record this meeting, I'd have everything I needed to destroy Chad completely. But I couldn't just walk into Chad's office with a recording device. I needed to be smarter, more strategic. That's when I remembered the old intercom system that connected all the executive offices to the main reception area. It was analog, outdated, and supposedly disconnected, but I'd seen maintenance workers testing it just last month. I spent the weekend in the back room, using my access to the building's electrical plans to trace the intercom wiring. The system was still active, just switched off at the main panel. All I needed was 5 minutes alone in the electrical room to reactivate the connection between Chad's office and the reception area, where I could record everything. Monday morning, I arrived early and slipped into the electrical room. The intercom panel was exactly where the building schematics indicated, and reactivating the connection was simpler than I'd expected. By 9:45 a.m., I was sitting at the reception desk with a small digital recorder hidden in my purse, waiting for Chad's meeting to begin. At exactly 10 a.m., I heard Chad's voice crackling through the old intercom speaker. "David, thanks for coming in. I wanted to discuss the Henderson account adjustments." For the next 20 minutes, I recorded every word of their conversation. Chad discussing percentage arrangements with Martinez, details about routing military supplies through Meridian Strategic Solutions despite their blacklisted status, plans to increase the handling fees on upcoming Navy contracts, and most damning of all, Chad's casual mention of using his father-in-law's influence to avoid military audits. When Martinez left Chad's office, I had everything I needed. Not just evidence of fraud, but proof of ongoing criminal conspiracy involving military contracts, blacklisted vendors, and the systematic theft of taxpayer money intended for our armed forces. But I still couldn't move yet. Chad was about to be promoted to Chief Operating Officer, a position that would give him even more power and protection. I needed to time my revelation perfectly, ensuring maximum impact while minimizing his ability to cover up or deflect blame. The promotion ceremony was scheduled for Friday. I had 4 days to prepare the final phase of my plan. 4 days to destroy Chad Walker completely. Thursday afternoon, I compiled everything into a single, devastating package. 27 pages of evidence, meticulously organized and cross-referenced. Bank statements showing mysterious deposits into accounts registered under Emma Walker's maiden name. Shipping manifests with altered weights and phantom charges. Screenshots of emails discussing percentage arrangements with blacklisted contractors. And the crown jewel, a complete audio transcript of Chad's conversation with Martinez, discussing their plans to defraud the Navy's upcoming logistics contracts. I didn't send it to Chad's father-in-law. Richard Hudson was family, and family protects family, regardless of the evidence. Instead, I sent it directly to Margaret Torres, the head of internal audit for Hudson & Kiner's parent corporation, Tri-State Holdings. Torres was a former federal prosecutor who'd built her reputation on rooting out corporate fraud. More importantly, she answered to shareholders, not to the Hudson family. I sent the package at 6:47 p.m. on Thursday, timed perfectly to arrive in Torres's inbox first thing Friday morning, exactly 2 hours before Chad's promotion ceremony. The subject line was simple: urgent. Evidence of systematic fraud in military contracts. Immediate action required. Then I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and waited. Friday morning. I arrived at the office early and positioned myself in the back room where I could monitor the building's activity through the security cameras I'd learned to access during my weeks of investigation. At 8:15 a.m., I watched 3 people in expensive suits enter the building and head directly to the executive floor. At 8:32 a.m., Chad's assistant hurried past my door carrying a box of files toward the elevator. At 8:45 a.m., Chad himself stormed past the back room, his face flushed with panic, talking rapidly into his phone. I couldn't hear the conversation, but his body language told me everything I needed to know. Margaret Torres had acted quickly. The promotion ceremony was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the main conference room. By 9:30 a.m., I could hear the murmur of voices and the clatter of catering equipment being set up. Richard Hudson had flown in from Chicago specifically for his son-in-law's big moment. Board members, department heads, and key clients had all been invited to witness Chad's ascension to Chief Operating Officer. At 9:47 a.m., everything changed. I watched through the security feed as Margaret Torres entered the conference room with two men in dark suits who looked like federal agents. The animated chatter died instantly. Richard Hudson stood up from his chair, confusion and anger evident even through the grainy camera footage. Chad wasn't in the room. I'd been tracking him through the building's security system, and he was currently in his office, frantically shredding documents while his assistant stood guard at the door. Too little, too late. The evidence I'd provided was already in federal hands. At 10:15 a.m., the conference room emptied. The catering staff began packing up untouched food and unopened champagne. Richard Hudson left through the back exit, avoiding the lobby where employees had gathered to whisper about the sudden cancellation. At 10:33 a.m., I watched Chad walk out of the building for the last time. He carried a single cardboard box, the contents of his desk reduced to a few personal items. His face was pale, his expensive suit wrinkled, his carefully styled hair disheveled. The man who'd destroyed my career with such casual cruelty now looked like what he'd always been, a small, weak person who'd finally been caught. I remained in the back room until 11 a.m., then calmly walked to the elevator and rode it to the executive floor. Chad's office was already being sealed with yellow tape, his computer removed, his files boxed and labeled as evidence. Margaret Torres was waiting for me in the hallway. "Ms. Morgan," she said, extending her hand. "I believe we have a lot to discuss." I shook her hand firmly. "Yes, ma'am. I believe we do." Chad Walker's reign of corruption was over, and my real career was just beginning. The investigation moved swiftly. Within 2 weeks, federal agents had traced Chad's network of shell companies, frozen multiple bank accounts, and identified a fraud scheme that had siphoned nearly $800,000 from military contracts over 18 months. The Pentagon launched its own investigation, and Hudson and Keener faced potential debarment from all government contracts. Richard Hudson called me into his office on a Tuesday morning. The man who'd seemed so powerful and intimidating when he'd hired Chad now looked decades older, his face drawn with exhaustion and shame. "Ms. Morgan," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I owe you an apology, and the company owes you a debt of gratitude." I sat across from him in the same chair where I'd once nervously interviewed for a coordinator position 5 years ago. This time, I wasn't nervous at all. "I'm offering you the operations manager position," he continued. "Full restoration of your previous responsibilities, plus oversight of our new compliance protocols. The board has approved a significant salary increase, and you'll report directly to me." I accepted graciously, though we both knew this wasn't charity. Hudson and Kiner needed someone with unquestioned integrity to help rebuild their relationship with military clients. I was the obvious choice, the employee who'd sacrificed her career to expose corruption. The response from my colleagues was predictable. Marcus from accounting suddenly remembered all the times he'd always respected my work ethic. Sarah from HR started inviting me to lunch, acting as if she hadn't sat silent during my demotion. Others who'd avoided eye contact during my exile now smiled warmly and offered their congratulations. I remained polite but distant. I'd learned exactly who these people were when I needed them most, and that lesson wouldn't be forgotten. The work itself was challenging but rewarding. I implemented new audit protocols, restructured our contractor verification process, and personally reviewed every military contract that crossed my desk. Slowly, we began rebuilding trust with the Pentagon, proving that Hudson and Keener could be relied upon to deliver exactly what we promised. 3 months after Chad's arrest, I was leaving the office late when I spotted him across the street. He was walking out of a competing logistics firm, carrying the same cardboard box I'd seen him leave with on that final Friday. Apparently, the job interview hadn't gone well. When he saw me, he stopped. For a moment, we stood there on opposite sides of the street, separated by traffic and the wreckage of his former life. Finally, he crossed over, his expression a mixture of desperation and grudging respect. "Jessica," he said quietly. I underestimated you. I looked at him. This man who'd tried to destroy my career, who'd stolen from our military, who'd corrupted everything he touched, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. You should have learned not to betray the people who were protecting you, I replied. He nodded slowly, understanding that this was as close to forgiveness as he'd ever received from me. Then he walked away, disappearing into the evening crowd with his box of rejection letters. I never saw Chad Walker again. Last I heard, he'd moved back to his hometown in Ohio, working at his brother-in-law's hardware store. His wife had divorced him, taking their house and custody of their daughter. The federal charges were still pending. As for me, I'm still at Hudson and Keener, still cleaning up messes, still proving that competence and integrity matter more than connections and charm. The difference is that now, everyone knows exactly what happens to people who try to destroy me. Some lessons are worth learning the hard way. Thank you for listening to this story of workplace revenge and justice. I'd love to hear from you. Comment below and let me know where you're listening from so we can connect with fellow listeners around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts about Jessica's journey. Have you ever faced similar workplace challenges? How did you handle them? Your stories and insights make this community stronger.